Okay, that's more or less what's happening. There's a lot more happening there, but I really want to get onto the theme. And the theme is the Anglo Saxon impact on Israeli society. And the major impact that our Aliyot have had was started in 1948 with Machal. Most people know the name Machal, right? Mitnadvei Chutz La'aretz. The people, soldiers, coming out of the Second World War by and large, volunteered to go and save this little country being born. Now, the most famous of them, of course, was Mickey Marcus. And people will know the name Mickey Marcus. Mickey Marcus was the first general in the Israeli army, in the IDF, in Tzahal. He belatedly, after he was shot by a sentry, I'll tell you a quick story. Mickey Marcus was an American lieutenant colonel who had battle experience, and he joined and set up a very important yechidot in the IDF, and he fought in Latrun. His battleground was the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. He didn't know any Hebrew. And one night he came out of his tent, he was challenged by one of the guards. What's the password? I don't know what he's talking about. The guy shot him and killed him. And you can imagine, right? Now, the main focus of the impact, in my estimation, and again, it's me, right? But you'll find it's more or less accepted, is through the setting up of the Air Force. And people know the importance of controlling the skies in the Middle East right up to this very day. Now, Israel didn't have an Air Force in 1948. Nothing, right? The Egyptians were bombing Tel Aviv. And four guys, right? Chalmers Goodman, I'm going to go through the names, I'm going to go through them individually, one by one. Ezer Weitzman, Eddie Cohen, and a guy by the name of Milton Rubenfeld. Milty Rubenfeld was his name. Names you haven't heard of. The four of them brought the Air Force from Czechoslovakia, and there were four planes. Nobody knew, including the Israelis, by the way. I'm just making sure I get the names in the right order here. Secret. The first day, it was in May, I think it was in, they took off, and I want to read you what Ezer Weitzman said. Now, remember who Ezer Weitzman was, right? And us as Brits, Anglo-Saxons will know very well who Ezer Weitzman was, right? Then became president. But he was trained in the Rhodesian Air Force. He fought towards the end of the Battle of Britain. And he was a pilot, a very good pilot. But this is what he said. On the ground, the military situation was critical. And in the air, the Egyptian Air Force was king of the skies. It could do literally anything it wanted. Its Dakotas and Spitfires bombed Tel Aviv and only encountered sporadic anti-aircraft fire. Of course, there was no time to worry about trifles, he called them. They had what was called the S-199. So it was a Spitfire that had been adapted by the Czechoslovakians for the Israeli Air Force. They had never taken off. This is him speaking, right? This is him, right? Or even tested in flight. Their parts had not been checked. No one knew whether their systems functioned or not, or whether the bombs would actually drop or the guns would fire. These questions had to be shoved aside. We swung out to sea and swooped upon this Egyptian column that was heading for Tel Aviv. I'll stop there. The Egyptians got such a shock that the Israelis had an air force, they halted the column. And they didn't go any further. Okay? And that literally saved Tel Aviv. It was almost like in 73 in the Valley of Tears that everyone goes mad about this nonsense docudrama. But the Battle of the Valley of Tears saved Israel in 1973. The Syrians suddenly stopped after this battle. In the south of the Golan, everything was open. They could have come down the Golan Heights and Israel would have been cut in two and God alone knows what happened. But they stopped. In 1948, the Egyptians suddenly saw this air force. They didn't know it was only 4 planes. And by the way, one of them was shot down. Well, they think he was shot down. Eddie Cohen's plane never came back. And he was never, ever found. He was a South African. Anyway, so there are 3 names that I want to talk about in particular. The first one is a guy by the name of Chalmers Goodman. Chalmers Goodman became the test pilot of the Israel Air Force. He was one of the aces in the American Air Force, Jewish guy, and he became the test pilot for the Israel Air Force. Nobody knows this name. If you do know the name, put your hand up and say, yes, I know the name. I'd be very surprised if you do. The second guy, great story. This is a guy by the name of Milton Rubenfeld. He was shot down. This is later in the war, about, I think it was about September, October. He was shot down over Kfar Vitkin, parachuted out, came down. Now, he also couldn't speak a word of Hebrew. Remember, these guys have come out of the Second World War by and large, or been full-time in the American Army or the British Army. So he gets shot down. The fighters of Kfar Vitkin, the Israelis, don't know there's an Israeli Air Force. Secret. They think he's an Egyptian pilot, and they're ready to kill him. And he starts shouting, gefilte fish, oy vey. He starts shouting, literally. Now, that could be an urban myth. I'm not sure. Nobody knows what he's shouting. But he had to convince the Israelis that he was the Israeli Air Force. And one of the 4 planes, by then there were more planes coming in, they had more planes. But one of the 4 planes of the Air Force had been shot down. And what the Israelis did, they took all the sort of the bits and pieces that they could use from this plane, like the machine gun, and used it. That makes for a great story, right? Gets shot down, you say, oh, you can filter fish, and he survives. The next guy, also a fascinating story. One of the elite units always through the Israeli army has been the paratroopers, the tzanchanim. You got a red beret and red boots as opposed to black boots, right? You were a macha, to put it mildly. Everybody wanted to be in a tzanchanim back in the day. Now everybody wants to be in a cyber unit, obviously, right? And then the cyber, but it doesn't matter. But back in the day, if you had a red beret and red boots, and you didn't go to the Air Force, because the slogan was, Hatovim L'tais, the best go to the Air Force, the second best go to Tzanchanim. This guy was a Brit who set up the paratrooper unit. He set up the paratrooper school, and he really was responsible for there being such an important Yechidah, Tzanchanim, the paratrooper unit in the Air Force. Okay? Let's get down to the modern day. So that's hugely, just let me go back. Oh, it doesn't matter. People get the point, right? 1948, Machal, the impact was literally the survival of the state. And I really believe that. And nobody knows the real detail. It's important to know the detail of the Anglo Saxon contribution, not only on the money side of things. We'll come to that in a minute. Okay, so what's happening today? These are the numbers. Now, I'm leaving the Australians and the New Zealanders out in Australasia because, you know, number-wise, it's not all that significant. 200,000 North Americans, about 22,000 South Africans. Now, the UK is complicated, really interesting. There are about 100,000 UK Jews who went on Aliyah through the years and live in Israel, according to the 2011 census, right? But here's why it's complicated. Something like 6% of the 236,000 Jews in the UK by the 2011 census. There are 236,000 of us, by the way. 6% of that number, you can work it out yourself, I can't actually go through it at the moment, have got Israeli passports. You understand what I'm saying here? People like me, for example, who have both an Israeli and a British passport. And remember, there was a time I knew a lot of Brits who were commuting to Israel and working out of Israel. They'd leave on a Sunday, work in Israel Sunday afternoon, or catch the first plane on Sunday, or go overnight Sunday night, and come back Thursday. Lawyers, accountants, a lot of it was important because they had the language skills then. So probably 2012, that era, for about 4 or 5 years. And then with Zoom and all the digital and all the technological advancements, didn't matter where you were. You could live anywhere and work for an Israeli company. And it's not by chance, by the way, that the fastest growing Israeli community, or let me put it differently, the city that has the fastest growing Israeli community is Berlin. That's thinking a minute. Okay, so those are the numbers. The big impact, though, is what's happening with young people from North America and a bit from here as well. The Elson family, you've probably heard of, rich billionaire Israeli who made his money in the casinos of Macau, I think. He died recently. His wife has taken over the whole enterprise. But they set up this thing called Birthright and Nefesh B'Nefesh, which pays for every young Jew to go to, between the ages of 18 and 25, to go to Israel on this birthright thing and see what it's like. And many of them have then graduated right to Nefesh B'Nefesh, gone on Aliyah, and have gone on Aliyah through this system of Nefesh B'Nefesh and birthright. Costs a fortune to the foundation, obviously, but they multi-billionaires. They were the big supporters of Netanyahu, by the way. They were going to set up the newspaper. Remember, we went to this whole thing of, I won't go into it now, but the whole scandal. And one of the things that he's charged with, he was being supported by Edelson. Okay. Now, in 2018, 3,700 Olim from North America and the UK, I didn't want to go into too much, we're only from here, but you get a few hundred from here, but mainly from North America. Now, that's not a huge number. When we've seen what's happened over the last 5 weeks that we've looked at the impact of the Aliyot from the Sfaradi, Mizrahi environment, the Ethiopians, the Russians, we have a different kind of impact. That's why I put the emphasis initially on Machal in 1948. But now, ours is a very different one compared to those that were outlifted. What's the word? Airlifted out of. It's a good word, outlifted. I can put that for the Oxford Dictionary next year, outlifted. Airlifted out of the Arab countries, right? Why? Because our impact, and this is a generalization, but it's true, has been middle class, wealthy. In other words, people have arrived with money. And educated, I could have put it into inverted commas, I'm not sure what educated means, but it's by and large people that have got degrees, lawyers, doctors, accountants, teachers, those kind of person, those kind of people. Personally, it is an experience that really rankled me about the Anglo Saxon impact. And here's the story. In 2012 or 2011, it might have been, I was the executive director of a big American English language testing company called Educational Testing Service. If any of your children or grandchildren ever went to go and study in the States, they had to do an SAT. We, as a company, had set it down. Anyway, I was the executive director in the UK. One of my tasks was to enlarge our area. And I thought a good area would be Israel, because Israelis have got a bit of English and they're learning English. I know the English language environment. I'm going to try and set up an office in Tel Aviv. Great idea. Very excited. Flew there, and I met with the CEO of a big English language training company, the biggest in Israel. Young Israeli woman, she's about 35, 36. Very powerful, very, I remember her, Labriot, whoever's not muted, Labriot, bless you. I arrived there, and we go to set up everything. She takes me out for lunch, and I say to her, what language would you like me to present this whole thing in? Because we're getting about 25, 30 teachers into this meeting to see what their interest is in using our testing mechanism within the Israeli training environment. She looks at me like I'm from another world. She said, what are you talking about? We're having this discussion in Hebrew, right? She said, what are you talking about? I said, what do you mean what am I talking about? I can do it in English or in Hebrew. Tell me which is the better, which would have a better impact. She said, these people don't speak Hebrew. I said, what are you talking about? She said, these are the English teachers. They've been here 25 years. They've never, ever had to learn to speak Hebrew, and they don't speak Hebrew. So you have to do it in English. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And it was dead true. There are communities within the big Israeli community that have no need to learn Hebrew. Never had. They live in Savion. If people know where Savion is, one of the richest suburbs of Tel Aviv. Or in Herzliya. They can watch English television, either BBC or CNN or whatever you want. Their friends are all English speakers. And their kids, they speak to in English. Why do I need to speak Hebrew? And it just blew me away. It literally blew me away. Obviously, they're not the majority, right? I've got friends on the kibbutz that I lived on whose Hebrew is not as good as mine. And they've been there for 35 years longer. So bear that in mind. The last thing I want to talk about is the impact on Israeli society. And I started hinting at that when we spoke about it in the debate. That's why I wanted the debate to be there. There is no doubt that from the American Aliyah, and it's primarily American, and there are a fair amount of Brits as well, by the way, in this messianic, hawkish settler movement. And I don't hesitate to talk about this, by the way, because part of their push and pull of Aliyah, that's what we talked about. We speak about that in South Africa when I was younger. I went on Aliyah. You had the push and the pull. The pull of Israel, of your identity, and the push of the society where there's anti-Semitism, where you don't really fit in and you don't really want to be there. So the push and the pull were the two elements of our Aliyah. This Aliyah is about the pull more than anything else. And it's by and large, in fact, it's primarily religious. The next point we had, in inverted commas, I put here civilized Western culture, which is a nonsense, by the way. But one of the impacts that Anglo Saxon, that's why they used to call us Anglo Saxon, Israeli society through the last 73 years has always focused on being Western, not Middle Eastern. That's why America, I need to tell you America. America was like, back in the day, the Golden Medina. For a lot of Israelis, America was the kind of society they aspired Israel to be like. I'm not sure what civilized means, by the way, because we saw that through the last 5 weeks of how Eastern societies, Sfaradi, Mizrahi, even Russian, and no doubt Ethiopian, were considered not civilized, or not civilized enough like us, or not Western enough like us. It's changing, there's no doubt, because the generational change, and that was the discussion. I remember when we went on Aliyah, we were talking about coming to London. There was always a discussion that my generation, we were the chalutzim, we were the pioneers of the next generation. In fact, what we were doing is we were giving up our culture so that our kids would be Israeli. I said, hang on a minute. My life here is not a dress rehearsal for something that's coming after. And you can see where that ended up. But there's no doubt that the younger generation, music now, is becoming much more Eastern than it was in my day, where you'd have Israeli pop music would be based on like the Beatles sound, if you like, in the 60s and 70s. Now you'll hear a much more Sfaradi, Mizrahi, Israeli, and there's no doubt that Israeli music now is very different, and it's not trying to imitate our Western cultured world. And the last thing, language, the Anglo Saxon English language left a leg, still has a leg, still has an impact on Israeli society. There's no doubt. Because so much has been brought in through the medium of television. I remember when I taught, it was fantastic. It was a program, I think it was an ITV program. It had Israeli subtitles. So it would be shown in English, but with Israeli subtitles. And what I used to do with my classes was tape over the area where the subtitles were. So the kids could only appreciate the program by learning and listening and imitating what they heard. I also used music. I used Simon and Garfunkel's Bookends, if people know the album, as poetry. So language, I think, the English language, and of course I'm biased, had a major impact on Israeli society.